very anarchistic, you know, to the people, right? Power to the people. Right on.
We are the only ones that are going to save us.
Hello, everyone. I think maybe we'll give like 2 minutes or so for folks to filter in, and then I'm feeling a desire to get started. So, yeah. How does that feel, Samaya and Andrew?
Feels good.
Yeah, I'm feeling it.
Cool. Yeah, we were talking about Beyonce before this, so
Right. So if y'all hear drones, they're
No,
outside.
no, no. They were talking about Beyonce. They were. I am not going to be implicated in this.
right. But there were some critiques made, so if
Brother
I
said we.
disappear,
He said we is
We.
crazy. We
Oh,
French now.
they got us, bro. They got us.
oh no. But
Uh,
I think if folks hear me cut out or anything like that, it will be because the beehive has descended upon my home. So, yeah.
Makes that cut his
it's
mic right
okay. It's okay. They can't break my soul.
now. Okay.
Well, now it's really over for us.
It's done. It's truly done.
Ah.
I'm getting an oof from the chat. That's crazy. I didn't know it was that bad. I don't know if it's that bad.
On a scale of like 1 to like dad joke, it was, it's like a 7. It was cute.
Mm,
It was cute.
It's like
six
a
to
six,
seven.
7.
Do you see? Yeah, yeah.
Like a 6 or 7.
Hmm. Not too bad, you
Mhm.
know?
Not too bad. Give me 1 second, and then I think we'll start in a moment. All right. Welcome in, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm very excited to get to talk to Samaya and Andrew today. We're going to be having a panel discussion for about an hour, hopefully with some time for questions as well, but we're going to try to use our time as fully as possible. We'll be talking about Black anarchism, solidarity, risk-taking, social revolution. We've got a wide variety of topics, so very excited to jump in. I just want to get some announcements out of the way at the top of this. This discussion is presented by the Atlanta Radical Book Fair. That's happening on October 25th from around noon to 5:30 p.m. in the Auburn Avenue Research Library in downtown Atlanta. This year's book fair will feature panel discussions on topics like Black anti-fascism, the importance of physical media, so keep your books, and a report back from the West Bank and Palestine. There will also be radical publishers like On Our Own Authority and a movie screening from the Real Liberation Collective's African Film Nights. There will be plenty of books and zines for sale or distribution, and I think it's just going to be a really good time. So you can find out more at Atlanta Radical Book Fair on Instagram, and you can come visit us on October 25th at the Auburn Avenue Research Library. Um, so I really wanted to get to talk to these two folks, but they couldn't make it to the book fair on the 25th. So very excited to have both Samaya and Andrew here. I'll jump into some introductions and then I think we can get started. I will make a note that this conversation is being recorded, so just as a heads up for folks, we'll get to some questions at the end, but also feel free to type your questions in the chat down below. Cool. All right. So Samaya is a writer, educator, and multi-hyphenate artist from Virginia Beach. Her work focuses on accessible political education, Black resistance, and providing a free space for creativity and community. She has co-authored two critical essays with Charlie Banga entitled Autonomous Submersion and Tending to the Socially Dead, Analyzing Black Antagonisms. Her seminal essay, Annotations for Eric Gardner, is an Afro-pessimist, poetic prose piece that engages in wake work. Her vulnerable and personable approach to politics and content creation is what has attracted audiences to her video essays and literary writings. Welcome, Samaya. And I do have to say, if y'all haven't read Autonomous Submersion yet, you need to go do that. You need to go do that. I'll say it right here.
Thank you. That's so sweet.
Andrew Sage is a passionate writer, artist, and YouTuber hailing from the vibrant island nation of Trinidad and Tobago. Over the last 5 years, Andrew has cultivated a dedicated audience on his YouTube channel, Andrewism. Yes, it's that Andrew, exploring topics from solar punk to social revolution. He has also brought his voice and ideas to popular podcasts like It Could Happen Here and Seriously Wrong. I'll note that recently on the It Could Happen Here podcast, Andrew's been doing a series on anarchism in Latin America, which has been really well researched and I think just like a really in-depth, like contextual look at anarchism. Um, as an ardent anarchist and firm believer in power to the people, Andrew has dedicated his efforts to invigorating imaginations and encouraging people to create a better world in the shell of the old. So joining us in avatar form, we've got Andrew. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Great to have you both. I'm so excited to talk to y'all. I think when I was first thinking about this panel, I was thinking about how to like popularize a tendency towards Black anarchism. Anarchism itself is a politics that refuses hierarchy and domination, and it seeks to build societies based on mutual aid and free association. I like the definition of mutual aid by Dean Spade, which is like survival work coupled with a transformative vision for how we can meet our needs. And free association is the ability to flexibly determine our social relationships, our arrangements and organizations for our mutual benefit, and refuses coercion and binding. One thing that I've found is that it's a little difficult to articulate anarchism sometimes, especially to Black folks, because they can often see it as like a very white tendency, despite the existence of Black anarchists like Martin Sostre, Ashanti Alston, Kawasi Balagoon, Lorenzo Kamboa Irvin, who will be at the book fair on the 25th. Um, and so I think one thing that I wanted to do with this panel is ask the question of like how can Black folks like see themselves in this tendency? And I think one of the ways to do that is to see how the tendency has been always present in sort of Black folks' history. Um, so, question for both of you. Um, when did you start to become aware of the kind of like anarchistic tendencies in Black history? And how have Black folks engaged in those anarchistic tendencies?
Yeah, I think I more so was able to put this together when I started really engaging with Black anarchism, because then it became clear to me, like, oh, so Black folks have always done these things. We just didn't have a name for them. And I do have a few examples of the way this anarchistic tendency of Blackness does show up. And I guess I wanted to start with a quote from Zoe Samudzi and William C. Anderson, and this comes from their piece entitled The Anarchism of Blackness. The quote says, while bound to the laws of the land, Black America can be understood as an extra state entity because of Black exclusion from the liberal social contract. Due to this extra state location, Blackness is, in so many ways, anarchistic. African Americans, as an ethno-social identity comprised of descendants from enslaved Africans, have innovated new cultures, that word was gonna give me a stroke, y'all, goodness, and social organizations, much like anarchism, will require us to do outside of state structures. Black radical formations are themselves fundamentally anti-fascist despite functioning outside of conventional Antifa spaces, and Black people have engaged in anarchistic resistances since our very arrival in the Americas. So, what the anarchistic tendency of Blackness says to me is how, what are ways in which Black people have always had to engage in mutual aid, resistance, direct action. So, exactly what is cultivated within Black people's enclosure, within their captivity? What are we doing in that space to disrupt or destroy it? And so my first two examples kind of are examples more specifically of different forms of direct action, that anarchistic tendency that Black folks have gone to. In 1920, women incarcerated at the New York Bedford Hills Correctional Facility staged multiple sonic riots. And the name of that headline in the New York Times in regards to this was entitled "The Devil's Chorus Sung by Girl Rioters." Okay, so it was the yelling, singing, banging on the cages, any way they could disrupt to let them know, hey, this is what's happening here, this is what we are experiencing, and we're not going to go quietly. And in Wayward Lies, Beautiful Experiments, Saidiya Hartman immortalizes some of these women in this correctional facility. And since it's 1920, we have to remember at this time, this is where, house tenement laws are in play, vagrancy laws. So pretty much if you were Black, they were already finding ways to criminalize you. You're outside too late, you're outside without a guardian, you're out late at the theater, at the bar, your deviance already, because you're Black, that's now criminalized. And a lot of these Black women were sentenced to this correctional facility, because the judge didn't even look twice, didn't look up at them, and here they are. So to me, what this riot at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility says is resistance has a bold sound that refuses to go unheard or dismissed. Okay, like anarchy is a threat to the oppressive power structures that seek to control our bodies, our labor, our minds, and in some cases, even our love. So Esther Brown, Loretta Mitchie, and every Black woman confined at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility knew that submission and silence to abusive authority would never free them from their cages, from their literal cells. So if we must be captive to hierarchy, to the oppressive state, it will not be without the chorus of riots, the melody of yelling, and a symphony of banging. We will not go quietly, but rather with a burst of rambunctious, well choreographed chaos. So if they continue to enforce control over us, our resistance, our inherent anarchy will be a boisterous reminder that we are meant to be unbound, we are meant to be ungovernable. So I wanted to give that example of disruptive direct action within the cell. And before I go to my next example of direct action, I did want to kind of pass it off to Andrew if he had anything else he wanted to add about anarchistic tendency.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, even from the roots, from the ground, from Africa itself, resistance was taking place. And that resistance is primarily a resistance of asserting one's autonomy as an individual, but also asserting a community's autonomy. So you had entire villages sometimes relocating to avoid capture. You had people who refused to, be captured at all, who'd rather take their own lives, who'd rather take that one decision of determining what happens to them through that choice, either in Africa, in the holding cells, or on the ships themselves. And when they arrived at the plantations, the resistance was continuous. I typically on my channel talk about the forms of resistance that we take as fall into a couple different groups as an overall move to social revolution. We have the things we do to oppose the system and the things we do to propose alternatives. Right. If you watch my channel, I beat that topic to death. So on the opposed side of things, we have things we do to confront the system, things we do to refuse to cooperate with the system. And both tactics or both approaches were used by our ancestors. In terms of non-cooperation, you had feigned illness, you had sabotage, you had work slowdowns, you had, escape, temporary or permanent, and we'll get to the more permanent forms of escape later on. And these are all the things people did to undermine the productivity and profitability of the plantation regime. And this sort of resistance was not, of course, relegated to that non-cooperation. It also took the form of more direct confrontation. You had poisonings, you had uprisings, you had revolts and plots. You had our ancestors ensuring that the plantation owners lived in fear.
Mhm.
And I think that is a significant inspiration to me. On the
Mm.
proposed side of things, of course, our ancestors were not only fighting, they were also building, they were also preserving. You had, due to the social death created by slavery, the separation of families, the separation of tribes and communities, you had the creation of new kinship. Fictive kinship is the term used in academia, but it's basically the play aunties that we now recognize today, you know, the aunties and uncles who are not actually related to us, the cousins who are not really our cousins. That had its roots in those ties of fictive kinship developed on the plantation. That is the constructive work, the cooperative work of of community building that is part of resistance, of survival, that I think forms part of the Black anarchic tendency. There's also, of course, the mutual aid tendency found both in day-to-day life and also in larger projects, you know, both before and after emancipation. You had Black people engaged in, well, in the Caribbean, I think the term for this is lend hand, right? Which is where, you know, you have a big project that needs a lot of hands. And so you lend hand, you lend your support, you take part, and there's music and there's dancing, and there's food and drink, and you're doing work, but you're doing work for each other, and you're doing it in a way that is generative rather than simply draining and exhausting. And then, of course, women engaged in shared saving circles. They have different terms for them in different parts of the Caribbean and Africa and the US. In Trinidad, we know it as the susu, right? It's just a way of, you know, moving the pot around of savings and ensuring that everybody had the funds of what limited funds they had to meet their needs. There was also, of course, the ways that we preserved music, crafts, you know, even some of our language, the structure of the language or the words themselves has been maintained in different creoles and dialects. And all of these are efforts we have taken to assert our humanity, to maintain some sense of identity, and to defy the dehumanization and depersonalization that the plantation powers that be would have put onto us.
Yeah, I think that's perfect because it goes into my next example. So it was a perfect segue, especially with Andrew talking about the plantation.
Totally unplanned.
No, you're right on time. See, we here. Okay. One of the examples I had is we're thinking about the plantation, so more direct action that way, confrontational direct action. I think about the Stono Rebellion, and there are two accounts of the Stono Rebellion that happened on September 9th, 1739. One from an unidentified white official, and from actually Cato's great grandson, who was the leader of this rebellion. So 100 slaves between the Combahee and the Distal rivers met in the wood not far from Stono on September 9th. They elected a man named Cato as their leader. And then they proceeded to storm a warehouse, seizing weapons and taking good care of the white men that were guarding all those weapons, took everything that they would need for their revolt. And these rebels covered 15 miles. And on this journey, they stopped at every plantation on their route and wreaked complete havoc. And so the Stoner Rebellion to me is a clear example of how not only one plantation must go, but every plantation and those that choose to uphold it must go. It would have been easy for these rebels to be like, okay, y'all, we done got our plantation overtook. You know what I'm saying? We're good. Let's chill out here. But they said, no, there's some more. Let's keep going. And for 15 miles, this is what they did. And so, after taking all over the house, on a plantation, like Andrew mentioned, the celebration, sometimes the singing, the way we preserve that. There's an account from that unidentified official that talked about how when the rebels overtook a house, they celebrated with singing and dancing, taking liberation into your hands, owning your freedom. That was, of course, a means for them to celebrate. And something else about Stoner that makes me kind of wonder about is like, so when these slaves on this plantation that were already there, when the rebels came, when they saw the rebels, maybe that was a moment for them when they realized exactly how tightly those chains are clasped around them. And the visual of someone going about freeing themselves strikes something in them. So, in other words, that anarchistic tendency, these anarchistic acts, these demonstrations of autonomy can stir someone. I think they are contagious in that way. So me defying the social order can say to someone, I'm going to get free. Do you want to come with me? And, I'm not sure what the end looks like. The end could very well mean us meeting the grave. But this moment right here we have to take because the very next could mean our death anyhow. And, Andrew also mentioned mutual aid. And I think about the first known Black mutual aid society was the African Union Society that was formed in Newport, Rhode Island in 1780. The African Union Society offered full memberships to free people and limited memberships to those still enslaved. So no matter what your status was, you were still able to kind of get help. Oh, I see Andrew's not able to unmute. I don't want to keep going if you
Let me
good,
see.
Andrew?
Thank you. I'm out of muted jail.
Okay. It's okay if I keep
Nah,
going?
yeah, go ahead.
Okay, okay.
I just
I
had
just want
something to interject after.
Okay, cool, cool. So yeah, like Andrew was talking about with mutual aid, this is something that Black folks have always participated in from our first arrival here in the Americas, the sharing of resources. So you can think about in the post-Reconstruction era, Knights of Labor. This is a group in the 1870s and 80s that promoted cooperatives, cooperative stores, warehouses, collective lending. You had the Freedom Quilting Bee established in 1967 in Alberta. And it was a handicraft cooperative founded by women in sharecropping families. And then in 1992, this was after the uprising in South Central Los Angeles, following the police acquittal of the police in the Rodney King case. Food from the Hood, a student-led co-op at Crenshaw High School in Los Angeles, started a school garden and gave the produce to their low-income neighbors. And for my very last example, getting back to how enslaved women were also engaging in reproductive resistance and mutual aid. And I do want to read a quote from Sadiqa Hartman where she kind of summarizes exactly what we're talking about. She says, quote, "What did untested militants and smug ideologues know of truth in Tubman? Unlike unruly colored women, they failed to recognize that experience was capable of opening up new ways, yielding 1,000 new forms and improvisations. Could they ever understand the dreams of another world that didn't trouble the distinction between state, law, settler, and master, or recount the struggle against servitude, captivity, property, and enclosure that began in the barracoon and continued on the ship, where some fought, some jumped, some refused to eat. Others set the plantation and the fields on fire, poisoned the master. They had never listened to Lucy Parsons. They had never read Ida B. Wells or envisioned the riot as a rally cry and a refusal of fungible life. Only a misreading of the key texts of anarchism could ever imagine a place for wayward colored girls. No, Kropotkin never described Black women's mutual aid societies or the chorus in mutual aid, although he imagined animal society in its rich varieties and the forms of cooperation and mutuality found among ants, monkeys, and ruminants. Impossible, recalcitrant domestics weren't yet in his view or anyone else's. So Esther Brown's minor history of insurrection went unnoted until she was apprehended by the police. It would be a decade and a half before Ella Baker and Marvel Cook wrote their essay, The Bronx Slave Market, and over 2 decades before Claudia Jones, An End to the Neglect of the Problems of the Negro Woman. And so when we think about how enslaved women, they used their knowledge of plants and medicine and herbs, knowledge that was passed down from generation to generation, as a means of preventing pregnancy and attempting to induce abortions if that was the case. And so their knowledge was gender specific. So due to this, this is also a way that culturally what they are practicing, these things they already had, defied those norms, the cultural norms at the time. And so if you remember in Autonomous Immersion, Charlie and I discussed how motherhood was not a choice for enslaved women. It was enforced upon them. So this act of passing down remedies, assisting in birth or abortion, all of which came out of risk, this was out of necessity. Enslaved women were still choosing to do what they wanted with their bodies, despite how the economy of slavery still demanded their womb to produce more property. So the reality is that what happens when the factory that is the Black woman stops producing not only labor, but laborers? That is a disruption to the master's business.
I'm curious to hear Andrew's
Yeah.
sort of like interjection, and then I want to ask a question because I think, yeah, both of y'all are talking about very interesting contexts that I want to revisit. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we've been speaking of these anarchistic tendencies or anarchic tendencies, and not necessarily anarchist tendencies. And I think that is something that does deserve highlighting as well. This anarchistic tendency we're talking about is this drive to self-organize. It is this drive to balance the, assertion of the individual and the empowerment of the collective. And it is this general resistance to authority. I think it's something that we see throughout human history, see throughout our history. I think what the Black anarchist goal is to take that tendency and to expand it, to take that resistance to authority and transform it into a full rejection of authority. That's how we bridge that gap between the anarchistic and the anarchist.
Mm,
Somebody mentioned, the inspiration of seeing people resist, with the various historical examples and how that may have motivated others to act also. I think that is a role that we as Black anarchists have to play, of showing that example, of showing what is possible. Though it's something that you may not even consider until you've seen it for yourself. There are people who will be convinced by, the words and the philosophy and the arguments, but a lot more people are going to be convinced by seeing practice, by seeing something that they did not consider the possibility of until you demonstrated it. And I think that's part of the creative work of social revolution. We tell stories, we sing songs, we create culture. Even religion has been used in a radical form, spirituality. Martin spoke of the promised land. Sorry,
Mhm.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Let me not get too familiar, right? um, but we as Black anarchists need to, I think, push that further, to take that rejection of oppression to its fullest extent. And that is what I think of anarchy as, taking these tendencies of taking that natural human urge to chafe against, domination, and pushing it to its fullest ideological, personal, philosophical, cultural extent. And, a lot of Black people have not even considered anarchism before. A lot of them only know of it as associated with white people. And I think stories like these help us to make some of those connections in our tendencies. But I think we also need to, do our part to ensure that, those stories of those tendencies are not left there in the past, are not left there at the extent that our ancestors, that our forebears, or those before us would have pushed it. But we take it as a challenge that this is as far as they took it, we can go further. The Black Panther Party did a lot of good, but they didn't overcome the, hierarchical inclinations, the patriarchal inclinations. We can overcome those. Our ancestors managed to do a lot of things, and maybe they didn't overcome certain other things.
Yeah,
And
I'm
that
curious.
is
Sorry, finish
that
it.
is I think, yeah, that is, I think, what the role of telling these stories is, of having this inspiration is. It's not to say, oh, that's what they did, let's just let's just do that. It's to say, that's what
yeah.
they did, let's take it further. And that, I think, as Black anarchists, or as the Black anarchist, I don't know if you want to call it a sprouting resurgence, a new wave, I would say, of Black anarchists in, the 2020s and going forward. That is our task, I think. That is our role in this historical epoch, to do
Hmm.
what those in the past have not yet done.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Not a one size fits all. I think, our ancestors gave us kind of these blueprints. Hey, you can do it this way, maybe you can, but like find your own way. You're experiencing your
Mm-hmm.
oppression in this own way. So this is how we did it. What can you learn from us? And I'll do it your own way.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm curious about sort of like when we talk about this blueprint and maximizing this like kind of like rejection of authority and doing it in these really like in some ways like very confrontational ways, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
the context that you both spoke about were like prisons, plantations, places where Black folks are experiencing like a high degree of precarity and social death, right? Like exposure to disease, exposure to like abandonment and disinvestment, like not being fed, not being given the resources that sustain life, right? And so I'm curious about this relationship between precarity and risk taking. So the idea here is that, Black folks are indeed precarious, right? Like we have state forces arrayed against us, at least in the United States. We know policing is a racist institution that targets Black folks disproportionately.
Hmm.
We know that there are certain struggles in terms of like the environmental safety of Black neighborhoods, of Black people. um, we know all of these things like threaten us, right? And so I'm curious about how we can turn that into sort of like a risk-taking approach, as opposed to what I have seen some of is a little bit of like, oh, we're very precarious. The state will come down hard on like the things that we attempt to do if we struggle for our freedom. And so there's a kind of like a return or a retreat almost preemptively, before we go to, go to a confrontation, right? And so I'm curious about, like you've shared these examples of Black folks in extremely precarious situations taking risks to free themselves. And I wonder how we can use that to sort of, again, maximize this rejection of authority.
I
Yeah.
think
Go
you
ahead,
go
Andrew.
ahead first if you want. Okay. Yeah, I think it's important to highlight that, the response of the state towards, our confrontations is regardless of what form that takes. It is not about whether we are violent or non-violent, whether we choose to go on strike, whether we choose to burn down the Capitol. It doesn't really make a difference, in the sense that what they respond to is not the action itself, it's the effectiveness of the action. It is the threat that that action poses to their order, and so if it is that we want to threaten that order, we have to expect and be prepared for that response. There are a lot of comforts mixed into the system now, a lot of pacifiers, in terms of consumption, in terms of distractions, in addition to the precarity that takes new and old forms in the present day. And so it's very easy to get caught up in those things. But for all the ways that the system has complexified, has complicated itself, and globalized itself and all those things, authority, hierarchy, domination, it's still pretty simple at the end of the day. It is still those above who are claiming rights, and privileges that those below do not have access to, that are claiming control over resources, over people, over property that others are deprived of. And if we're able to keep our eye on the prize on what it is that allows them to maintain that control, which is, yes, in part the violence that they take, but also the ideological hold they have on the populace, the momentum, the inertia of the system that keeps things going in the absence of the baton or the tank, because you don't have, at least not in most places, I'm sorry to hear about Portland and DC and stuff, we don't have tanks rolling around on the streets on a regular. We don't have troops, at the with a barrel to the back of your skull every day keeping you in line. It is the ideological aspect of things, in addition to the material, that keeps us under control. And so I don't want us taking needless risks. We don't need to be engaged in adventurism. Radicals are unfortunately right now few and far between. We're growing in numbers, we're few and far between. So every radical's life is important. So you don't need to go out in a blaze of glory, because you're worth more to us alive than dead, right? You're worth more to us free than imprisoned. And so we have to be strategic in what approaches we take, in terms of, the acts we engage to confront, to refuse cooperation, and to build. But such actions ultimately need to be taken. They need to be taken in a way that will ensure that there's longevity, that it builds upon itself. And so the daring actions may have their role, the insurrectionary actions, the confrontational actions, the sabotages and the obstructions and the occupations. But we also have to make sure we have a base of mutual trust, of mutual support, of survival programs, of cooperation, of networks that can adapt and expand and exist both above ground and underground. Because I think without that foundation, without something to fight for, to fight to defend, our confrontations will just be for naught. It'll just be feeding more bodies into that machine. And it's a machine that is barreling towards all of our destruction. So we have to be really careful what we do.
Yeah, I think for me on the question of like, precarity and risk, I think especially when it comes to Black folks, what I've realized is that Black resistance can't be without risk when Black existence is and has always been at risk. When you're in a Black body, you walk out the door and you are, you're a target. Because to be in a Black body means you are marked. Violence or harm does not need an appointment or a reason to meet you. And so in some ways, I think if freedom is a possibility, sometimes that those risks, that it's kind of hard to separate those two. I think when I think about it, because when I'm thinking about all the risks that our ancestors took, and I can think about Harriet Jacobs and Joshua Glover, people that exemplify Black fugitivity, which for those who don't know, Black fugitivity, to give you a definition, that is the constant motion Black people find themselves in the pursuit of freedom. What is often reached, though, was merely a moment or a reprieve from the violence and restriction of their captivity. But so Black fugitivity provides no guarantees, but it's full of radical possibilities. So they were taking that risk because the possibility of freedom is what they were after. And, that reminds me when Saidiya Hartman in Lose Your Mother, she talks about freedom. She says, the kind of freedom that could be given to you could just as easily be taken away. Freedom is the kind of thing that required you to leave your bones at the hills of Brents Bay, or to burn the cane fields, or to live in a garret for 7 years, or to stage a general strike or create a new republic. It is won and lost again and again. It is a glimpse of possibility, an opening, a solicitation without any guarantee of duration before it flickers and then is extinguished. So when we're resisting, for those of us in Black bodies, we realize there's already risk because I'm choosing to defy this social order. And I think we have to accept it, just like, but is the possibility of my liberation, is the possibility of my freedom, what is that worth to me? And so therefore you ask yourself, so now the risk is worth it. So Harriet Jacobs, escaping from the plantation where she was, then she finds herself in a crawl space for 7 years, right? So she leaves this open enclosure in a sense to then find herself in a literal enclosure. But once again, she's always in search of that freedom. And then you have someone like Joshua Glover, and who was sold multiple times throughout his life, but in Missouri and on that particular plantation, he chose to run. He ended up in Wisconsin, and then he was recaptured again. But then when he was recaptured, a bunch of abolitionists at the time surrounded the prison, and with, screaming and chanting all those things, and they broke Joshua Glover out. And then he eventually made his way to Canada, and that was around 1888. So he was a free man. So once again, Joshua would travel at night, especially because during the day he couldn't. So I think for Harriet, for Joshua, what they're pursuing is just like, let's get to that reprieve for that moment. I'm going to always be on the move, and I'm taking a risk now, but the possibility of freedom means so much to me that I have to take it. So I feel like in a way I'm not able to kind of remove Black resistance and risk from each other, because I know in my Black body I'm already targeted. So when I'm choosing to defy that order that says I'm choosing to defy social death, all those things around me, well, this is a risk I'm willing to take. So yeah.
Mm. I'm really grateful for you introducing like sort of Black fugitivity and like flight from the plantation, right? Because one thing that we talked about when we met earlier to talk about this panel was the practice of like Marroonage or Marroonage. I've heard it pronounced both ways. I'm not sure which is right. We'll say either.
I tend to say Marroonage.
Marroonage, yeah. Okay, cool.
Marroonage is real fancy. You don't say Marroonage.
Yeah, it's
You'll say
very fancy.
Marronage, if you want to be
You know?
more Hispanic with it.
Now that we've litigated the pronunciation, I'm curious about if folks have a definition of that they want to share, and if they want to share how that practice is helpful to them in terms of thinking about struggles today, um, like Marnage Barunage is a practice that like defies borders in a very specific way. I'm curious if folks can think and talk about that. Yeah, so definition and then how it's helpful to you.
Sure. Shall I go first or?
Yes.
Oh yeah, to spell it, it's Marroonage. Marroonage. Right. So that is, the escape of enslaved people to form independent and self-sustaining communities. I think I think of it as a perfect encapsulation, really, of that social revolutionary spirit, both a rejection and something constructive, a destruction and creation, rejection of slavery and an assertion of freedoms. you know, Marroonage really, in at least in the Caribbean, and really wherever slavery was practiced, took two forms: the petit Marroonage and the grand Marroonage. The petit Marroonage is just people who would have run away from the plantation for short periods of time. They left their work, they would have gone maybe to look for a lover or to look for a family member living elsewhere. To connect with them just to get a reprieve, and they eventually would have either been forced to return or would have come back of their own volition. The grand Marroonage is really the sorts of things that we tend to be talking about here. It's the establishment of communities on the fringes, in the forests, in the mountains, you know, establishing settlements, using geography and secrecy and guerrilla tactics to defend themselves, constantly being vigilant, and in some cases even going on the offensive, like with Francois Macandal in Saint Domingue. He went on offensive campaigns. He used arson and poisoning to attack the plantations. So it's kind of what I was talking about with earlier, which is that we need something to fight for, something to defend. We need a base of operations. We need some kind of foundation to launch off of, and that's what the Maroon communities represented in some instances of resistance to slavery in the Caribbean. They It was not an easy life, of course. They had to sustain themselves through cultivation, hunting, raids, and they even engaged in trade in some cases with outsiders, with pirates, merchants. Um, it was difficult because, again, they're on the fringes. Population was not something that they could have just shrugged off, because with every new person, it's increases their chance of being discovered. So some groups, in the Guyanas, for example, it was a bit easier to get new recruits because the Guyanas are vast jungles. There's plenty of space. In other places, in Jamaica, for example, they limited the arrival of newcomers because they wanted to avoid detection. So if you weren't part of the original meeting, hard lucks, I guess. And I mean, I don't want to be too blithe about it, because it was difficult. Some even had to negotiate with colonial powers. In 1739, Jamaica and Maroons had to sign a treaty with the British. They got some autonomy, but they also had to submit to some British oversight, and they had to return runaway slaves. Um, and although many Maroon settlements have been destroyed since, are no longer with us, there are Maroons that have endured up to today in Jamaica and in Suriname. And I think we can take from their example, from their struggle, and be inspired by it, but not to stay to the extent that they took it. Because they weren't perfect. A lot of times they were organized in really strictly hierarchical forms. A lot of times they were heavily patriarchal. The lives of women in these Maroon settlements were not always the best, to put it lightly. But that's our role here, to take the baton and go further, not to take the baton and stand up where they left off, right? And so I think we can use Maroons, and I draw a lot of inspiration from Maroons in terms of exemplifying our ancestors and our capacity for autonomy and self-determination.
Yeah. I think especially it kind of makes me think of how when I think about Black fugitivity more so, it's kind of that constant motion, this pursuit of freedom. You're always on the move. And I think what I find myself asking lately when I think about even the ways in which Black people now have been able to carve out these spaces and create something for themselves, it's just now the biggest challenge is how do we extend these temporal moments of freedom beyond just a few days, a few weeks, a few moments, a few months? Because I think that's when we actually start seeing actual freedom in terms of just there's no restriction on it. I feel like And even then, that kind of brings questions like, do we even know what freedom is without restrictions? You know, and I feel like Black people have always, if anything, just tried to carve out that space. And I feel like the challenge we face is like, how do we extend that beyond these few moments or space and time where it's something that can be sustained, you know,
Yeah.
forever. So yeah, I think that's just the biggest challenge we face when we're engaging in Marroonage or Black fugitivity. We've seen the way our ancestors have done that and have done it for a certain amount of time, but now it's just we see once again constant motion having to change, you know, whether it's physical place. Now we're coming up with new language to talk about what we're experiencing, what we're going through, you know. And I like how Andrew said, you know, kind of uh who do we trust even within that space, you know? And with Joshua Glover, the reason he was recaptured in Wisconsin is because, you know, because of a friend that betrayed him. So we do see that. So I think there's always that risk too as well. But I think ultimately, just I think taking the initiative or the step to carve out that space, and it's going to take a lot of internal work as long as whatever physical work is needed to make sure that it's something that we can sustain, not just for a moment, but for a long time.
I'm curious that this idea of sustaining, right? The consistency of carrying forward a kind of like revolutionary spirit, like this rejection of authority, this rejection of hierarchy. To me, it gets into my idea of like what a social revolution is, right? Like a constant overturning and kind of like a projection into the future of these kind of principles of being, again, against hierarchy and domination, of like building a community where we could have our needs be taken care of and where our freedom was sort of like the guiding principle. I'm curious, like, yeah, of what your ideas of social revolution are. Like, how does this idea of Marroonage relate to social revolution? Um, like, what do we do essentially to overturn everything? Like, what's the plan there?
You want to take
Right,
it
right.
first, Andrew?
Sure, sure. I mean, Maroons, you know, they carved out these physical zones of freedom within very hostile orders. And today, I think we could take that example in carving our own zones, our own spaces, socially, culturally, economically. That may take the form of skill shares, education centers, maker spaces, mutual aid centers, community gardens, different efforts that we can sort of meet our needs collectively, separate ourselves, extricate ourselves from our dependence wholly on the system. And through that, I think reviving that spirit of community self-reliance, of solidarity. That is, I think, the safer route. You know, there's also the more bold actions we can take in terms of occupation, in terms of squatting, in terms of, you know, directly taking on, you know, the state and the capitalists and the powers that be. But, you know, we all have to start somewhere. And like I said, we're going to take risks carelessly. You know, I think we have to be considerate and flexible in the tactics that we approach. The Maroons would have blended different approaches at different times. They evaded when it was necessary. They negotiated when they were forced to. They confronted when they were able to, when they were empowered to, when they had, you know, that to their advantage. You look at guerrilla movements all over the world even today. You know, the reason guerrillas are hard to stamp out is because they don't take on fights that they don't know in advance that they can't extract a victory from. You know, it may not be a perfect victory, it may not be a war-ending victory, but guerrilla fighters, they choose the location, they choose the terms of engagement. That is how they're able to sustain their fight long term. And so I think we also need to reflect on that to recognize where it is feasible to confront directly, where it's necessary for us to disengage, where we can try to stay under the radar a bit and build quietly, you know, because, you know, I look at the examples of, you know, where all these protest movements have been leading to lately, right? We have these mass mobilizations of energy, of momentum, and we end up accumulating resources for what? We end up accumulating resources for bail funds. I'm not saying we let people out to dry, right? It's necessary to get our comrades out, where possible. But imagine if instead of having to bail people out, we could have used those resources to build something enduring, that was able to build something that would continue and would lead to the creation of further networks, of further, resources that we could build on top of, so that at the next protest, we have something to take that, to funnel that energy into. Where people are asking after the protest, what's next? What can we do next? Because I'm not saying don't protest at all, right? But what people are asking, what can we do next? That there's actually projects and efforts that could be invested into, either with time or with resources.
Mm. I think for me, when it comes to, what is, I guess, kind of what is to be done, or what do we do moving forward in terms of just social revolution, or having that extended amount of freedom, I think what I realize is that you can remove class, we can remove hierarchy, we can give people access to all those things. But the one thing that remains that I notice is anti-blackness, because it's very deeply embedded in our society. And so I think
Mm-hmm.
before anything, I feel like there have to be first a willingness to not only address the anti-blackness that shows up in every space, whether it's radical, leftist, safe, or what have you, but to address that, but also think of ways we are going to divest from anti-blackness in terms of the systems and structures that uphold it. And I think also when it comes to having a real genuine sense of solidarity, I also think about this would mean when we're building these new structures, we're divesting, we also have to think about our disability politics as well. How are we going to care for our comrades, that need help getting access to these things? Is this new world accessible to them? And what are we doing
Mm-hmm.
now to make sure that these spaces that we're in, these events we're hosting, that they can actually come and be a part of the community that's supposed to be there for them? So if we think about how Black folks have been excluded from the social contract, amongst other things, we're thinking about how when we're hosting these community events and these things meant to be for the people, we don't have mask mandates in place to make sure that everyone from that community can come. So now we're excluding our disabled comrades and community members from being there as well. So it's very easy to think about what we're going to do moving forward in the past, but I think right now we have to all address internally any anti-blackness that we perpetrate or contribute to every day, the structures that uphold anti-blackness, and also the way in which we're going to make sure this world is accessible to our disabled comrades as well, that are immunocompromised. So I think for me, I think a lot about what needs to be done right now internally to do before we really do any type of work externally. And I think it's an uncomfortable conversation, because I think what happens when Black folks are in these spaces, or they call out these things, they call out the ableism, they call out the anti-blackness, people feel uncomfortable. They don't like how that accusation or that talk makes them feel. So I think it really
Yeah.
trying to do that internal work to think, how can I address this? They're trying to distance themselves from that label. Like, let me get away from this before I really sit with what you said, right? So if we can get to a point we can actually talk about these things and actually address them, then I think then we may have something.
Yeah, and I really think that is where, we need to start establishing those spaces of encounter, those places where people can associate, people could hash out these things, you know, in person preferably, because I think the hiding behind the screen makes it very difficult, because it's so vulnerable to infiltration, it's so vulnerable to bot networks and these astroturfed campaigns that sadly go from being astroturfed to being actual legitimate issues within the community itself. I saw somebody in the chat had mentioned like the ADOS and FBA types and all these other different seeds of division that end up being planted and manage to sprout because of the state of the really diaspora as a whole currently. And it's not easy. We have to both engage with the rest of the world, the non-Black world, and also deal with all the different things that our people are dealing with. I think we have to start with who we have and what we've got. We have to make sure that there is something that everybody feels capable of contributing to, whether they're students, whether they're young, whether they're old, disabled, working, artists, activists, whatever. There are a lot of different forms that effort can take, but I think it's just a matter of really building that momentum and getting to a point where we can speak, where we can assert ourselves, and who vex lose, who is who is not able to handle it, who's not able to deal with unpacking their stuff, confronting their prejudices, their biases, their thin-skinnedness that cannot handle, being called out for the smallest of things or the biggest of things, who demand, as we were talking about before, even our public-facing conversation began, but who demand that they be handheld through every step of the process, and who demand so much of our time and energy, but seem so unwilling to invest any of their own. There's a lot to do. And I also think that it's important to know what your role is in that a lot to do, right? Because it's so easy to get stretched thin to think, oh, I have to do this, I have to do this, we have this project, that project. And you spread yourself so thin, or even before you spread yourself so thin, you get so jumbled inside that you do nothing. You get burnt out, either before you've done anything or by doing too much. Everybody has strengths, everybody has their weaknesses, everybody has their network, their circle, the people they can reach, the things that they have available to them. And you need within yourself to assess, who can I reach? What am I able to do? Maybe I'm somebody who is really good at, coming up with schedules or plans, or maybe I can offer my car and provide transportation, or maybe I can, you know, contribute some sort of art, or develop some resources, or maybe I have the skill to code and to develop a platform that people can use safely and securely. There are lots of different things to do, and a lot of things that we have within our power to do. And so it's about a matter of identifying it and really establishing and growing those networks.
Yeah, we're getting close to time, so I'm hesitant to prompt us a little bit more, but I think I might just try to close us out a little bit with, we've talked a little bit about these topics today, but both of you have done incredible amounts of research and publication as well in terms of getting these ideas out there. And, like Andrew was saying before we hopped on here, we were talking a little bit about, making introductions and on-ramps, but absolutely pointing folks to places to go to find out more and to learn. And I would love to hear sort of what both of y'all are working on, or places that people can find your work. Yeah.
Um, well, I've realized people, when they saw this announcement, were like, well, she hasn't uploaded in like a month. So just to clarify that, okay. That I am working on stuff, but just it takes me a while because I edit and do things by myself. But in order to keep up with me, you can always see, follow my YouTube, which there will be a new video eventually, I promise. But I'm really active on Substack and my Instagram. And yeah, I have those 2 essays that you mentioned that you guys can read, along with annotations for Eric Garner. So there's Autonomous Submersion, annotations for Eric Garner, and Tending to the Socially Dead. So Substack, Instagram, and YouTube, that's where you can find me. And a new video will come soon, guys. I promise.
Yeah, on my ends, I'm pretty fresh in terms of all the different things that I've been working on. Currently in the process of writing an At the Cafe for the 21st century. Um, and so that is a continuous work in progress. For those who don't know, At the Cafe is probably one of my favorite pieces of anarchist literature. It's by Errico Malatesta, and I want to really bring that into, our context and our modern day in a way that's accessible to people. So I'm working on that book currently, and I'll be posting news about that on my Patreon. I also obviously upload on my YouTube channel, Anarchism. And I have a video coming up very soon on building community. So it's pretty relevant to, what we've been discussing. I also, like G would have mentioned earlier, I co-host It Could Happen Here, the podcast from time to time. So you could find that wherever you find your podcasts. And I saw somebody comment something. I feel like I need to say the line. So all power to all the people. Peace. And regarding the recording,
Mhm.
I think we're gonna do like an
Yeah.
upload.
So I think we should be able to share that with the participants here, but also hopefully we can get that and post it and re-upload either on YouTube channels if folks are
Yeah,
interested
I
in
can.
that.
Yeah, I can. See
Yeah,
see,
I could
I
do it on my
told
side
y'all a
channel.
new video's coming. See,
There we go.
just like that.
I saw YouTube has this feature where you can now post across multiple channels the exact same video. It's like you can collaborate on a video post.
Oh,
I'm
perfect.
not sure if it's accessible to all channels yet though, so I'll have to check that. But
Okay.
that could be something that we do.
Yeah, so I think we'll try to get it up on as many platforms as possible so that folks can engage with it. I want to thank Andrew and Samaya again for being a part of this conversation. I have so many notes that I'm so excited to like look into more, and also it's always a pleasure hearing you both. It's been wonderful to engage with your content before this, but also to have you here for a live discussion. So thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
Yeah. And if you enjoyed this conversation, please join us in Atlanta on October 25th for the Atlanta Radical Book Fair, again at the Auburn Avenue Research Library. Again, you can go to at Atlanta Radical Book Fair on Instagram, and the book fair is again October 25th. So looking forward to seeing y'all in person if you can make it, and if you can't, see you in the sky. Thanks, y'all.
Peace.
Much appreciated. Peace.
Bye, guys.
It's not the destination.